Are we recording?
We are.
Ah, okay. So my name is Denny, but everybody calls me Denny. And there is a story about how I got my name and became Denny instead of Denny. And it all has to do with class. And so I'm going to talk about class, ethnicity, gender, and use that as a way of letting, I guess, whoever looks at the video know a little about me before I talk about my research. So when I was 3 years of age, my father, this is after the Second World War, I'm very old, my father joined the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And so every district where there was an inspector, there was also a chairman, and they were usually upper class. So my father was a coal miner before the war, and neither of my parents went to high school. And so after the war, he was working at Dunlop's, actually on the furnaces, and then joined the RSPCA. And we arrive in Ashford in Kent for his first post as an RSPCA inspector. At that point he couldn't drive. My mother had driven a bread van during the war, and I was 3. And so Lady Ritchie, who was the wife of the chairman, Sir James Ritchie, when there's a Sir in England, the wife takes the surname as part of her lady. She's not Lady James Ritchie, she's Lady Ritchie, and he's Sir James. And she arrives at my mother's house, this tiny little house that we just arrived at with no furniture. And she comes in and meets my mother, who actually kind of curtsies because she's never actually met anyone with a title before. And Lady Ritchie asks about my name. And I remember this. And so my mother says, my parents are Welsh, Denny is a Welsh name. And so they say, my mother says this is Denny. And Lady Ritchie says, that's much too complicated a name for a little girl. Call her Denny. And she'd stay for a few minutes and she left. And my father came home and my mother said, Lady Ritchie came. And they're kind of overwhelmed by the fact that this very upper class lady had arrived at the house to begin with. And then my mother says, and she says that we can't call Denny anymore, we have to call her Denny. And I can actually see my parents looking down at me as I'm, transformed from Denny to Denny. I don't know what conversation they had about this, but that was it. So that's my class story about being working class, a coal miner's daughter, and almost like royalty saying, her name is too much, you have to call her Denny. And I actually didn't know until I was probably in my late 20s that this was a problem. And I was at Columbia studying for my doctorate, and someone came in to do some kind of lecture and started by saying to turn to your person sitting next to you and tell them how you got your name. And so I tell this story, and it upsets the person sitting next to me, who then brings it to the whole class. And so everyone is discussing about the fact that my name had been taken away and that I was 3. I was Denny for the rest of the time. So it wasn't until I was 30 that I understood that this was very much an incident that told us something about class, especially in England. So I wanted to share that story. And then I think that so the story about class, and then a story about ethnicity or race.